Mary Wollstonecraft was an English philosopher who lived from 1759 to 1797. She is considered the founding mother of feminism. She wrote the first feminist book, called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Wollstonecraft wrote several other books. Her first book was called Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. Other books included Mary, a Fiction, A Vindication of the Rights of Man, an historical and moral view of the French Revolution, among others. Mary died after giving birth to her second child, Mary Shelley, who is the author of the famous book Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft was only 38 years old when she died. I am sure if she had more time, she would have written a lot more, since she was extremely prolific, even in the difficult circumstances that she faced. In this video, I will focus on the vindication of the rights of women. The main goal that Wollstonecraft was trying to achieve in this book is to create a convincing argument for the education of women. She also developed a few pioneering theories in her book. These were all way ahead of her time, and for this I believe she's owed a major place in the history of philosophy. I will present a few examples of the original theories proposed by Wollstonecraft in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. First, there's this idea that identity is socially constructed. This theory was highly original. Wollstonecraft argued that characteristics like femininity do not come about naturally, but are socially constructed and serve a social function. The second idea is that hardships are necessary for virtue. Wollstonecraft argues that keeping women as protected playthings, or in a dollhouse, so to speak, prevents women from acquiring virtues of character. A third is the idea that subjugation perverts both sides. This idea is extremely interesting and deserves a longer analysis. I will explain it more thoroughly later, but simply put, it claims that in a situation of subjugation, both the people who are subjugated and those who subjugate are corrupted. In the rest of the video, I will present these three ideas in detail. First, let's talk about Mary Wollstonecraft's gender construction, which she argued was mostly related to a socially determined attitude that kept women in an uneducated state in order to make them docile. I will explain how she was mostly responding to Rousseau's Émile, which was a book about education, especially Rousseau's depiction of Sophie, who was Émile's partner. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French philosopher who lived from 1712 to 1778. He wrote a treatise on education where he advocated for a more natural approach to education. His main idea was that civilization had become too contrived and artificial, and that a more natural approach was necessary. Even though boys were to be educated in a more natural way with plenty of time to play outside and explore their natural instincts, Rousseau argued that women were to be educated mostly to serve man. This is what Rousseau says in Émile, and I quote, "The whole education of women ought to be relative to man, to please them, to be useful to them, to make themselves loved and honored by them, to educate them when young, to care for them when grown, to counsel them, to console them, and to make life agreeable and sweet to them. These are the duties of women at all times and should be taught them from their infancy." Wollstonecraft obviously disagreed with Rousseau, and a significant part of her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, is a reply to Rousseau. The main argument at the time that people used to justify the idea that women shouldn't be educated was that they were not endowed of reason at the same level as men, and therefore they did not require the same education. Interestingly, Rousseau in Emile starts by talking about women as mothers and saying that women are responsible for early education in man and that this is important and essential and how it should be. To this, Wollstonecraft answered, how can women educate man if they're not themselves educated? Regarding the idea that women were not rational and did not have the same ability as man, Wollstonecraft said that it was unfair to point to current women who had not been educated as an example of why women couldn't be educated. Instead, she proposed, let's try to educate women and see what happens. If women's capacities are inferior, they won't learn. But if they do learn, it is not by nature that they are less developed, but by lack of education. Wollstonecraft also pointed out that anyone who refused this experiment in education, by principle, would be acting in bad faith. Then she adds that the real reason why education was not allowed for women was that there was an interest in keeping women subjugated. I'm going to quote Wollstonecraft. Strengthen the female mind by enlarging it, and there will be an end to blind obedience. But as blind obedience is ever sought for by power, tyrants and sensualists are in the right when they endeavor to keep women in the dark, because the former only want slaves and the later a plaything. The sensualist, indeed, has been the most dangerous of tyrants, and women have been duped by their lovers, as princes by their ministers, while dreaming that they have reigned over them. Women, Wollstonecraft recognizes, are brought up to serve their husbands. And worst, they're supposed not just to serve them, but also to love their masters. Many of the characteristics that we deem feminine still today were instilled in order to facilitate this subservience. Traditional feminine traits include, for instance, vulnerability, empathy, beauty, caring, dependence, obedience, and so forth. These were deemed to be natural traits of women, but Wollstonecraft challenges this idea and argues that these are socially constructed in order to create submissive wives. For women to start exhibiting traits outside of these traditional traits, she argued, we must begin by giving them access to the same education that men have access to. Wollstonecraft therefore proposes a public elementary education system with boys and girls learning together from an early age. The schools would not only be mixed in terms of gender, but also in terms of social class and income. This way, she thought, we can start to see what women were really capable of, and also to see what the difference in class and reality really amounted to. Let's move to the second idea, the idea that hardships are necessary for virtue. Wollstonecraft argues that keeping women as protected playthings who grow up in the dollhouse, so to speak, prevents women from acquiring virtues of character. Here she's talking about the higher class, the coquettes of her time. This idea is not in itself new. Aristotle had said that in order to develop virtues of character, one has to act. And in order to act, one has to have the opportunity to act. What's new with Wollstonecraft is that she noticed that women of the higher classes were especially lacking in virtue because they were raised as coquettes, dolls for the purpose of the enjoyment of man. They were artificially kept in an infantile state and not allowed to face any real world adversity. This, she claims, leads to a lack of character rather than a good life. The argument is that in order to build character, we have to find some sort of adversity, not too much, but enough. This view is a precursor to Nietzsche's view. Nietzsche argued that we need pain and suffering to overcome ourselves, and that the abhorrence to suffering leads to an underachiever in life. This part of the argument is a way to respond to the claim that women are happy to stay at home and be sheltered from the hardships of the real world. They are happy not to have to do manual labor and other labor outside of the home. That they are happy to never have to engage, say, in the battlefield, and so on. Wollstonecraft argues that this is indeed a source of unhappiness, not happiness, since women were not given the opportunity to build character, and since character is what would allow them to have their best life, if they are completely sheltered, they're actually being done a disservice. The third and most original idea proposed by Wollstonecraft is the idea that subjugation perverts both sides. Those who have the power to subjugate, she argues, end up abusing their power, and those who are subjugated because they don't have real options, they end up conniving and contriving in order to get their goals. Both behaviors are immoral. Let's start with the subjugated. Wollstonecraft gives us examples of classes that were subjugated during her time: women and soldiers. Women were subjugated, they were brought up to play the role of someone in the service of their husbands and lacked any legal independence. For this reason, they needed to use trickery and cunning in order to get what they want. And trickery and cunning are not virtues. Soldiers will be superficial for a similar reason. Soldiers are trained to obey orders and told not to think. For this reason, they do not develop the critical thinking of an adult and are infantilized, just like women. Wollstonecraft jokes that this is probably why women like men in uniform. Let's get to the subjugators. Those who subjugate are going to be immoral as well. They often act with impunity, and they know they will be obeyed. This leads to abusive behavior, which also can hardly be called virtuous. The prime example of the corruptibility of subjugation is the power of kings, Wollstonecraft says. History has proven over and over again that giving unlimited power to a sovereign makes for a bad sovereign. Husbands, she said, had a similar power over their wives, and it's no wonder that they often abused it. One side has too much liberty with impunity, and the other side has not. These positions corrupt both sides, the powerful and the powerless. The powerful need to have their power checked, and the powerless need to have freedom in order to make their own choices. Wollstonecraft writes, and I quote, "Moralists have unanimously agreed that unless virtue be nursed by liberty, it will never attain due strength. And what they say of man I extend to mankind, insisting that in all cases morals must be fixed on immutable principles, and that the being cannot be termed rational or virtuous who obeys any authority but that of reason." This position is a predecessor to Kant's idea that morality requires freedom and must be based on reason, as well as the idea that someone should never be used as a mere means, which is what happens in subjugation, according to Wollstonecraft. I hope that you enjoyed learning about Wollstonecraft. In my opinion, her highly original philosophy should be included in any Intro to Philosophy class. She was a precursor of philosophers such as Kant and Nietzsche, and she was the founding mother of feminism and a precursor of so much contemporary work. For these reasons, she deserves a privileged place in the history of philosophy.